World History of Christianity, Chapter 7, Part 1, Reformation and Counter-Reformation, Andrew Pettigrew. The Pre-Reformation Church. The influence of the Church in European society in the late 15th century was all-pervasive. Leading figures in the church hierarchy could have reflected on an institution with an unchallenged position at the heart of the community. Robust, intellectually vigorous, and assured of a role in almost every aspect of human existence. In some parts of Europe, up to 10% of the population were members of the institutional church. Collectively, the church was Europe's biggest landowner. The clergy played a vital role in the lives of all late medieval communities as dispensers of sacraments, managers of hospitals and schools, and providers of vital services such as writing and literacy. No European rulers could ignore the church in their political calculations. The Pope was a major political force in his own right and a constant fixture in the strategic alliances of the day. No one could have anticipated that the church was about to be faced by a challenge which would shake it to its foundations and leave it 2 centuries later permanently divided. The Reformation in this respect was a movement of many paradoxes. In its first intention, a movement of renewal and reform, the division of Western Christendom was a wholly accidental and unforeseen consequence. And although it would result in the withdrawal of up to 1/3 of Europe's population from obedience to Catholicism, the Reformation was in no respect a consequence of religious indifference. On the contrary, the Church on the eve of the Reformation gave every sign of being an institution in rude good health. Indeed, it is now argued that the century before the Reformation was characterized by a degree of engagement in matters of worship and theology, especially on the part of the laity, unprecedented in medieval Christianity. This was an age of church building and religious enthusiasm. In Suffolk, England, during the 15th century, something approaching 50% of parish churches were substantially remodeled, as citizens poured the new wealth generated by a successful wool trade into their religious lives. This was an age of great religious art, stimulated by the growth of the cult of saints. Increasingly during this period, popular medieval saints were adopted and invoked as guardians and protectors, and honored for their benevolent interventions in the lives of those who invoked them in sculpture, painting, and shrines. The collection of relics, small mementos of saints' lives or preserved parts of their bodies, became almost a cult in its own right. Some aristocratic collectors amassed huge collections, each carefully and often magnificently housed in custom-made reliquaries, and each carrying a documented remission from the torments of purgatory for those who gained upon them. Albrecht of Brandenburg, Renaissance prince and patron of artists, amassed a collection of such magnificence that the assiduous visitor could accumulate a remission of some 6 million days. One of his greatest rivals as a collector in Central Europe was, ironically enough, the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, later Martin Luther's patron and protector. This was an age of pilgrimages and ostentatious public devotions, nor was the crusading urge entirely dead. More than one Renaissance prince aspired to lead a new Christian expedition against the Turk when more immediate European conflicts were settled. And this was an age in which the individual's ceaseless search for a sense of the divine was manifested in ever more elaborate devotional practice, and the pious expenditure of much hard-earned wealth. The commitment of the laity received tangible expression in a financial investment of unprecedented proportions, in the provision of funeral masses, voluntary offices and sermons, and the purchase of indulgences. What then was required to move people out of this deep and for the most part unquestioning commitment, and in many cases to turn them furiously against institutions to which they had given so much in both emotional and financial terms? To such a question, there can be no simple answer. And it is worth remembering that the 16th century call for reform would elicit a very different response in different parts of Europe. But for historians, with the benefit of hindsight, there were sufficient indications, even in the robust good health of the late medieval church, of why, when a climate of criticism emerged in the 1520s, it achieved such a popular resonance. In the first place, the evidence of the Christian layman's ever-increasing support for the church was itself slightly double-edged. With the increasing investment of their wealth and time went rising expectations. The 15th century witnessed a great expansion of lay literacy and education. University education was no longer a clerical monopoly. In urban communities and princely courts, it was no longer necessary to rely on clerics to act as clerks, scribes, and schoolmasters, as had been the almost exclusive tradition of the early Middle Ages. And many of the religious institutions newly popular in the 15th century, such as confraternities, represented not only lay commitment to the church, but a desire on the part of the laity to take greater control over their religious lives. Confraternities were associations of pious laymen, often based around a tradecraft and guild, who paid subscriptions for the purpose of having a priest say masses on behalf of their deceased members. It followed that the priest so engaged was in effect their employee, and in the 15th century an increasing proportion of the clerical estate relied on such positions for their livelihood. The German city of Hamburg had no fewer than 99 confraternities in 1517. Most urban communities of any size had a variety of such institutions. In some parts of the church, such as England, even the parochial clergy were increasingly dependent for their salaries on voluntary financial donations, raised by the church wardens on behalf of the parish. Not surprisingly, lay people in return felt able to insist on a high standard of service in those they employed. The capacity of the clergy to respond to these increased expectations varied greatly in the different parts of Europe, and even in different parts of the clerical estate. In England, for instance, the parish clergy seem to have enjoyed a high level of confidence among the population at large. Reasonably adequately trained and well disciplined, English priests seem to have given little cause for scandal. In this they were given an exemplary lead by their bishops, few of whom could be seriously criticized for their moral conduct. Cardinal Wolsey, who acknowledged a bastard son, was a great exception among the English bishops. Most English bishops also played an active role in the administration of their dioceses. Pious, conscientious bishops were to be found in most parts of Europe, but in some countries they were clearly very much the exception. In France, most bishops were either non-resident royal officials or the younger sons of the local nobility. In the Netherlands, the structure of the church was so archaic that a growing population of over 2 million was served by only 4 bishops. But it was in the German Empire that the condition of the church gave most cause for concern. Germany teemed with clergy, many of them ill-educated and penniless indigents, with no hope of a position. At the other end of the scale, Germany's bishops were often great princes of the church, ruling over an independent princely state, their appointment jealously guarded by the Pope, and often the subject of an intensely political negotiation, not to mention the payment of a substantial fee. The prelates, for their part, often exploited the resources of their office with a ruthlessness which differed little from that of secular landlords, except insofar as through their spiritual office they enjoyed access to opportunities to raise funds denied to temporal lords. Clerical privileges often included the right to sell produce gathered on their lands in neighboring urban markets without paying the usual duties, an exemption inevitably fiercely resented in these communities. Meanwhile, a regular and substantial sum might be generated by the tax bishops collected from the more humble clerics of their diocese who wished to keep a wife. This tax was paid by up to 60% of the clergy in some dioceses, such as Basel. Clerical and monastic landlords also played their full part in the reimposition of serfdom, with which landlords secured their workforce in the wake of the Black Death. Less immediately resented was the exploitation of spiritual benefits, such as the trade in indulgences, a relatively accessible and highly popular means of seeking some assurance of favor in the afterlife among Germany's Christian population at this date. The great disparities of wealth, status, and education were a source of considerable tension within the clerical estate. Prominent reformers within the clergy, such as Dean Colet, in his famous Convocation sermon of 1509, made frequent and passionate calls for a renovation of the quality of religious life, to begin with the clergy themselves. But it was increasingly doubtful whether the traditional institutions of the Church were themselves sufficient to create the momentum for a wide-ranging movement of reform. The history of medieval reform movements was in this respect salutary. The agenda of reform ostensibly lay at the heart of the conciliar movement of the 14th and 15th centuries, but increasingly became subsumed in a political struggle for control of the papacy. Prominent individuals who allowed their call for reform to stray into overt criticism of a politicized and often corrupt papacy, such as the Bohemian Jan Hus or the Florentine prophet Savonarola, were condemned as heretics and destroyed. The conflict of authority that lay at the heart of conciliarism was eventually resolved in favor of the papacy, but the legacy in terms of practical reform was modest. Prominent lay people interested in reform could legitimately doubt whether the institutional church could provide the leadership for the wholesale renovation of the Christian life which many saw as necessary. Some of this skepticism was seen in the movements of popular devotion which posed an increasing challenge to the more traditional piety of the monastic orders, in any case under threat from the increased vitality of parish religion. In England, pious donations to religious houses had declined steeply, even while parish-based religious institutions were generously supported. Many religious houses were in difficulties long before the Reformation, with criticisms of the sincerity of vocations and a serious shortage of manpower. The need for reform was widely recognized in parts of the religious orders themselves. The agenda of change was of obvious relevance to the new intellectual movement known as humanism. Humanism was not, in its wider sense, primarily concerned with church reform. The rediscovery and celebration of classical civilizations, which lay at the heart of the Renaissance, was a development of far wider application in the world of education, scholarship, and the visual arts. But an intellectual movement of such force could not leave the church untouched. To the extent that the humanism of the Renaissance celebrated the capacities of man to govern his own destiny, it proposed a worldview fundamentally at variance with that of the Church. At the same time, humanists celebrated and acknowledged the growing self-confidence of a newly articulate Christian laity. Such sentiments explain the huge popularity of the Enchiridion Militis Christiani, Handbook of the Christian Soldier of Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch scholar of humble origins who became a figure of European renown with the publication of this vision of the active Christian vocation. Erasmus was one of a growing number of writers who employed wit and satire to decry the failings of the institutional church, criticisms which would provide a corrosive background to the more frontal attack of Protestantism in the 16th century. All of this was important, but the greatest contribution of humanist scholarship was in its championing of new standards of critical scholarship in the fields of theology and the classics. Humanism promoted a remarkable renaissance in the study of Greek and the ancient civilizations of the Middle East, including significantly the original languages of the biblical canon. The rigorous scholarship which restored the uncorrupted text of many Greek and Latin authors could also be applied to testing the received text of Scripture, principally the 4th century Latin translation of St. Jerome known as the Vulgate, against original texts. This was a process which set the new scholarship on a potential collision with a church hierarchy, which gave great weight to the accrued authority of church tradition and which regarded the Vulgate as hallowed and sacred. The potential dangers of the new scholarship in this regard were demonstrated when Erasmus's celebrated new translation of the New Testament seemed to challenge the scriptural basis for the doctrine of penance. The techniques of the new scholarship were eagerly embraced by many in the expanding university world, including those, like the young Martin Luther, not instinctively drawn to the implicit secularity of the humanist project. But left to itself, humanism posed no particular danger to the established church. The danger would arise if the theological skepticism of the intellectual critics of the church could be articulated in such a way as to tap into the broader seams of dissatisfaction which existed among the laity. It was precisely this combination which, emerging from an obscure quarrel among religious professionals in the 1520s, would shake the Western Church to its foundations. Luther and Germany. Luther's role as a catalyst of change was in many ways ironic, for until his criticisms of indulgence selling brought him into conflict with the church hierarchy, with such faithful results, Luther's career had been conventional, indeed notably successful. Luther was a Catholic success story, an example of just what was possible within the pre-Reformation church. Born the son of a successful mine owner in Saxony, Luther reaped the benefit of the educational revolution of the late Middle Ages, attending successively the cathedral school at Magdeburg and the University of Erfurt. The decision to enter the Augustinian monastery at Erfurt, taken against his father's will, was a turning point, after which Luther rose steadily through the ranks of his order. A lecturer at the University of Wittenberg in 1507, Luther represented his order on business in Rome in 1510. By 1512, he was Doctor of Theology and a rising force in the local university, recognized in Wittenberg as a powerful and effective preacher. It was also during these years that Luther began to formulate the new theological understandings that would later underpin his theology. Luther was prone to depression throughout his life, and this may have been the background to a fundamental recording of his thought with relation to judgment and salvation. Like many of his contemporaries, Luther found the concept of God as judge almost unbearably oppressive. The breakthrough came from a reading of Romans 1:17. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. Luther came to see that this could offer the prospect of mercy, not the damnation he saw as the inevitable consequence of his fallen state. Far from being judged, the suffering Christian was in fact rescued by God's free gift and Christ's sacrifice on the cross. There was no sudden revelation, and Luther's concept of justification by faith built on a solid body of doctrine within the Catholic Church. But it did mean that when Luther later became embroiled with his own superiors, he had to hand the conceptual framework for a radical disavowal of the traditional framework of authority, a reordering of the theological order which would prove powerfully incendiary in the particular circumstances of the German Empire. For all that, the issue which made Luther into a public figure was prosaic enough. Indulgence selling was already a much criticized aspect of late medieval devotional practice. The offering of pious donations against the hope of mercy in the afterlife was obviously prone to abuse, pandering as it did to the most basic fears of ordinary Christians, and the manner in which the St. Peter's indulgence was preached would have offended many less tender consciences than Luther's. The organization of fundraising through this indulgence in northern Germany was, in fact, a highly sophisticated piece of Renaissance finance. In 1514, Albrecht of Brandenburg had been raised to the Archdiocese of Mainz, but since he intended not to surrender his previous diocese of Magdeburg, and was in addition under the canonical age to be a bishop, the Pope was able to insist on a considerable fee. He agreed in return that 50% of the monies raised from the preaching of the indulgence in Albrecht's two dioceses could be set against this sum. The whole transaction was underwritten by the Fuggers of Augsburg, Germany's principal banking house. It was a shoddy enough deal, made more offensive by the vigor and lack of sophistication with which the indulgence was preached around Magdeburg by Albrecht's agent, the Dominican friar Tetzel. Reports of Tetzel's activities spurred Luther to action. In October 1517, he published his 95 Theses against indulgences, a call for academic debate wholly justified by Luther's position as university professor. What Luther could not have anticipated was the widespread public interest which followed. Electoral Saxony was some way from the commercial heart of the empire, and despite the growing prestige of its new university, Wittenberg was at this stage not one of Germany's established intellectual centers. Yet within months, Luther's theses had circulated widely, reprinted in Leipzig and Nuremberg, and in the great international printing metropolis of Basel. Soon news of Luther's controversial writing was spreading among the intellectual community around Europe. By early 1518, Erasmus in the Netherlands had heard and approved of Luther's protest against abuse within the church. Luther and the debate over indulgences soon became a fashionable cause among humanists and churchmen who had themselves been critical of abuse within the church in the preceding years. Public reaction was critical to Luther's fate. So too was the fact that the church hierarchy was slow to perceive the wider implications of his call for reform. In part, this was a result of political circumstances which relegated Luther to the margins of a complicated agenda. The Emperor Maximilian died in November 1518, and it would be a full 6 months before his grandson Charles had secured the succession. In the meantime, those concerned with the future direction of imperial policy were fully engaged, and critically Luther's patron, the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, had to be courted as a vital influence in the forthcoming imperial election. In consequence, Frederick, a devout Catholic, but fiercely proud of his new university and its suddenly famous local professor, had to be indulged in his perverse sponsorship of this turbulent friar. It was not until May 1520 that Luther's theses were formally condemned in the papal bull Exsurge Domine. Luther made full use of the interval afforded by the slow processes of papal justice. His first big test was the meeting of the Augustinian chapter at Heidelberg in March 1518. Luther spoke well and effectively. Hereafter, members of his own order would be his most resolute early supporters. The following year, 1519, Luther confronted in debate one of the most effective of his growing army of Catholic critics, the Ingolstadt theologian Johannes Eck. Eck forced from Luther some damaging concessions. Rather than accept the orthodox judgment first pronounced by the legate Cajetan at Augsburg the previous autumn, Luther now claimed that the Pope himself did not have the final authority to interpret Scripture. The ultimate authority was Scripture itself. This was the sola scriptura principle, which became, together with justification by faith, an intellectual cornerstone of the Reformation. Through all of this, Luther was writing feverishly, a torrent of writings in Latin and German, which simultaneously widened the scope of his criticisms of the church and brought them to a wider public. As it became clear that his own church would ultimately disavow his criticisms without the debate he sought, Luther moved to an ever more pessimistic and apocalyptic understanding of the role of the church hierarchy. Even before Leo X had agreed to condemn Luther, Luther had written off the Pope as an agent of Antichrist. This was radical indeed, and it may be asked why so many Germans were prepared to honor Luther as a prophet and leader despite the increasing violence of his language. It was essentially Luther's gift as a writer which saved him from isolation and destruction, culminating in his three great tracts of 1520, The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, On the Freedom of a Christian Man, and To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. Luther developed in numerous tracts and pamphlets a complete manifesto of reform, a call for the radical renovation of the German church and the life of the Christian. It touched a sensitive nerve, both with Christians struggling like Luther with their own relationship with an apparently vengeful God, and with secular powers resentful of the power of the church in the lives of the German cities and princely states. It was a powerful cocktail of resentments, and one largely unique to Germany. Thus, by the time the new emperor, Charles V, came to meet the Diet of the German princes at Worms in April 1521, Luther was already a major public figure, his image familiar from an increasing flood of pamphlets and illustrated broadsheets. The emperor, a devout Catholic, had no wish to meet Luther, and intended at first merely to proclaim the Pope's recent condemnation of his views. The German princes, however, insisted that Luther be heard, an ominous indication of the shifting balance of power within Germany. Luther therefore appeared personally to answer the charge of heresy. In a famous scene, he refused to recant his views. More crucially, his safe conduct was honored, and Luther was permitted to leave Augsburg unharmed. Although Charles now proclaimed the imperial ban against Luther, he had lost his last best chance to snuff out the movement. Luther was now dependent again on his loyal and supportive protector, Frederick the Wise. For a year after the Diet at Augsburg, he remained incarcerated in the Wartburg Castle, held there for his own protection by the anxious Frederick. He occupied himself with writing and study, most constructively by beginning the new German translation of the Bible, which would be his greatest and most enduring literary achievement. But even in his absence, the movement continued to grow. In Wittenberg, his university colleague, Andreas Karlstadt, ensured that the momentum of reform was not dissipated, introducing into the local liturgy a new German Mass. A similar pattern was established in many towns across Germany, as sympathetic laymen and clergy took up the call for the renovation of church life. In many respects, this was the crucial moment, as the call for reform finally outgrew the scandal and turbulence raised by the drama of the Luther affair. It now became clear that in pursuing his own increasingly violent quarrel with the church hierarchy, Luther had tapped into a broad seam of resentment about the German church, which spoke to the concerns of many of his fellow citizens. In the pamphlet war of 1519 through 22, Luther certainly pursued his own theological agenda, but he was also careful to embrace a wide agenda of long-held grievances about the church. The provision of clerical services and the widely resented fees clerics charged for sacramental offices, tithes, clerical immunities. Thus, although Luther's central theological message, justification by faith, was a real inspiration to many, what really struck a chord was his call for a return to pure scriptural teaching, with its implicit criticism of scholastic theology and a clerical ethos which left laymen excluded and disadvantaged. The preaching of the pure gospel, Rein Evangelium, became the slogan of those who followed Luther in his call for a total renovation of church life. This was most clearly expressed in the German towns. Germany in the 16th century was a land of towns. The landscape of the empire was densely packed with cities, many of them, like Nuremberg and Augsburg, centers of both a highly developed trade and cultural life. Some 65 were free imperial cities, self-governing territories which enjoyed a wide measure of political independence and separate representation in the imperial diet. In the years after 1521, most of the cities experienced evangelical agitation from priests and laymen sympathetic to Luther. By 1525, several, led by Strasbourg and Nuremberg, were prepared to follow the example of Wittenberg and proclaim the introduction of a new German service and the abolition of the Mass. By now, the movement had clearly outgrown the theological concerns of its founder. Luther returned to Wittenberg in 1522 and continued to write and preach, a torrent of new writings which scarcely abated and largely drowned out his Catholic critics. Reprinted freely across Germany, Luther's own writings make up an astonishing 25% of the vastly increased number of printed books published in these years. None was more influential than Luther's German Bible, the practical embodiment of his call for a return to biblical simplicity. But for all Luther's towering presence, a movement of this complexity could hardly remain under the direction of one man. Inevitably, the call for reform unleashed a vast and unruly surge of emotions, only imperfectly channeled by Luther's own reforming agenda. Not all those inspired by Luther would share his ultimate goals or his innate social conservatism. Luther had a first inkling of this on his return from the Wartburg in 1522. In his absence, Wittenberg had been convulsed by a group of self-appointed lay apostles, the so-called Zwickau prophets, who, supported by Karlstadt, had preached a much more radical reform than was acceptable to either Luther or the electoral court. Luther's return nipped this in the bud, but his influence could hardly be felt with the same force elsewhere in Germany. The most damaging manifestation of this untamed energy was the Peasants' War of 1525. Although Luther's teaching found its most immediate resonance in the German cities, it also found many admirers among Germany's rural population. Here Luther's teaching of the social gospel, the equality of Christians before God, had a particular appeal, especially when applied to long-held grievances about the harsh conditions of rural life. In many parts of rural Germany, the church was deeply unpopular. The clergy were resented as harsh and oppressive landlords, not least for the reimposition of serfdom and the harsh terms of labor services extracted as a traditional due in addition to rent. In 1525, Many parts of Germany rose in revolt. Such peasant unrest was far from unprecedented. A similar series of risings, known as the Bundschuh, had smoldered along the Rhine basin for the previous 20 years. But now, ominously, the peasant leaders clothed their traditional grievances in the new language of evangelical justice. Third, it has until now been the custom of lords to own us as their property. This is deplorable because Christ redeemed and bought us with his precious blood, the lowliest shepherd as well as the greatest Lord. To those who had denounced Luther as a social revolutionary, the Peasants' War appeared the final vindication. Luther himself, terrified that his movement would now be abandoned by the socially respectable, denounced the peasants and called for their suppression. By 1526, after a series of bloody engagements culminating in the wholesale slaughter of the Battle of Frankenhausen, the revolt had been put down, but at considerable cost. Luther's own reputation was permanently damaged by the frantic violence of his polemic against the peasants. More fundamentally, the war and its aftermath made clear the boundaries beyond which reform could not be extended. In Germany's free cities, and in those states where the prince acted as sponsor, reform would proceed, a process which in the long term inevitably led to the increase in the power of the secular authorities at the expense of the church. But those who had interpreted Luther's call for reform as an opportunity for social leveling were driven out of the movement. Increasingly, they were confined to the wilder fringes of evangelism, sustained by self-styled prophets and preachers of little theological training. The defeated and disappointed victims of the Peasant War were the first adherents of the unofficial Reformation, which found its most powerful manifestation in Anabaptism. The shock of 1525 proved only a temporary setback. In the years immediately following, more of the imperial cities adopted the evangelical agenda, joined now by the first of the princes who officially adopted the movement in their lands. By 1529, they were sufficiently strong to band together to defy the Emperor Charles V, who continued to insist that his condemnation of Luther, proclaimed at Worms in 1521, be enforced. The evangelical protestation against this decision in 1529, the origin of the word Protestant, was followed in 1530 by the adoption of a common declaration of faith, the Confession of Augsburg, now in effect the creedal statement of a new church. In the following decades, the new movement consolidated its hold in the German lands. Luther himself, now securely established as patriarch of the new movement, accommodated himself to these developments. Mellowed by experience, the apocalyptic energy of his early preaching was replaced by the more practical work of church building, to which Luther contributed a new genre of instructional literature, his German Catechism. In this aspect of his work, he was ably assisted by other talented men. Johannes Bugenhagen, who wrote church orders for many of the first Lutheran lands, and Philip Melanchthon, the quiet intellectual who contributed the first systematic exposition of the Lutheran faith, the Loci Communis. By the time of his death in 1546, Luther's church had transformed the landscape of religious life in Germany forever. The Reformation outside Germany. Outside Germany, Luther's movements never achieved the same impact. The circumstances which permitted the rapid dissemination of Luther's message were too particular to his homeland. This was partly because of the empire's unique political and social makeup, a highly urbanized society where the central political institutions were exceptionally weak. Although the Emperor Charles V was determined to combat the Lutheran movement, he was ultimately powerless to impose his will on cities more concerned at the reaction of their own populations, and princes eager to exploit the controversies for their own ends. Also, Luther himself was a quintessentially German figure. Alongside an intensely serious and personal theological message, Luther also contrived to speak directly to the immediate concerns of his fellow countrymen, their frustrations with their religious life, their resentment of foreign interference in the German church. Little of this would have the same force outside the empire. Outside Germany, too, those who took up Luther's call for reform often met with far more determined opposition than was the case in the empire. Here, papal condemnation of Luther's teachings tended to carry more weight, and those who espoused Luther's doctrines did so at the hazard of their lives. The first Lutherans to die for their faith were two Augustinian monks from the Netherlands, Hendrik Vos and Jan Verder Eschen, executed in Brussels in 1523 as Charles V clamped down savagely on local manifestations of the German heresy. Here, in his patrimonial lands, Charles V could sustain the ban on heresy that he was powerless to enforce in Germany. Yet in the years immediately following the outbreak of the German controversies, the impact of German events was certainly felt across wide parts of Europe. Luther's writings were known and read in most parts of Europe. Individual admirers of his work can be identified as far away as Sweden and Scotland in the north, and in Spain and Italy in the south. But the call for reform seldom provoked the same turbulence or inspired the degree of popular support as had been the case in Germany. Where Protestant churches were ultimately established, it was generally through the agency of a sympathetic state power, as was the case in Scandinavia or England. Outside Germany, it was not surprising that the Reformation should have its most immediate impact in Switzerland. The Swiss Confederation was, in its social and political structure, not dissimilar to the empire, well provided with proud, independent cities, grouped around an inner core of rugged mountain cantons. The Confederation had won independence from its Habsburg overlords in 1499, at the end of the Swabian Wars, at which point it was effectively separated from the Holy Roman Empire. The close relationship between Swiss German and High German meant that there was no significant language barrier for evangelical writings to overcome. Most of all, the Swiss Reformation had its own inspirational leader in Ulrich Zwingli. Appointed to the prestigious post of Leutpriester, people's priest, in Zurich in 1518, Zwingli pursued a clear-minded agenda of reform, which had much in common with that of the German cities. Zwingli had read and admired Luther, but there is no reason to doubt that reform in Zurich proceeded to an independent agenda, and Zwingli was able to call on considerable support from within Zurich's ruling elite. Spurred on by Zwingli, in 1525 the Zurich Town Council formally abolished the Mass, giving Zwingli and his colleagues a free hand to complete the work of reform. The Zurich Reformation, so swiftly concluded, became a magnet and inspiration both within and beyond the Swiss Confederation. Many, both in the German cities and elsewhere in Europe, would in due course prefer the more radical Zurich model of reform to Luther's more conservative version. But within the Confederation, the response was more ambiguous. Zurich was one of the biggest and most powerful of the Swiss cantons, and its zeal to spread the evangelical message could easily be interpreted by its less powerful neighbors as a pretext for asserting Zurich influence over the Confederation as a whole. Thus, whereas the urban cantons, most equal in size and self-confidence, Bern and Basel, swiftly followed Zurich into the evangelical camp, the smaller inner mountain cantons resisted, a resistance prompted in equal measure by their antipathy to Zurich and their loyalty to Catholicism. Towards the end of the decade, goaded by interference from Zurich, the Catholic cantons went to war twice to defend their independence. In the Second War, inflicting on Zurich a crushing defeat, which also cost the life of Zurich's inspirational leader. Battle of Cappel, 11 October 1531. Zwingli's death at Cappel put a decisive break on the development of the Zurich Reformation. Within Germany, the eclipse of Zurich tilted the balance decisively back towards Wittenberg, much to the relief of Luther, whose antipathy towards Zwingli's theological writings had already provoked unseemly and damaging polemicizing between the two men. Within the Confederation, the Catholic cantons had effectively sustained their right to independent religious choice. On the Protestant side, too, the fronts were drawn. From this point on, the most significant development would be the extension of Bern's influence into the French-speaking territories at the western end of the Confederation, which in 1532 encouraged the small city of Geneva to throw off the rule of its prince-bishop and declare for the Reformation. 4 years later, John Calvin, a young French exile, arrived to assist the process of consolidating the new evangelical order. It was hardly to be anticipated, but this was in fact the beginning of the emergence of a new order, which would in due course eclipse Zurich as the leading force within the Swiss Reformation. In other parts of Europe, the influence of Luther's movement often traveled in the footsteps of German immigrants and merchants. In both Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, it was the small German communities who first read and disseminated his doctrines, enthusiastically seconded by students who had studied in Wittenberg before returning to their homeland to spread the word. The lands of Eastern Europe proved, in fact, surprisingly fertile ground for the Reformation, a circumstance now disguised for posterity by the later success of the Counter-Reformation in reclaiming Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland. But in the decades following the German Reformation, Luther's movement made a profound impact. Bohemia, now the Czech Republic, and Hungary in particular, were well integrated into the Central European economic system, with strong trading and communication links with Germany. The precious metals of the Czech lands were mined by an international community, which included many German settlers from across the border in Saxony. The Bohemians, too, had their own reasons for welcoming Luther's reform, not least its apparent endorsement of their own religious revolt against Rome as followers of the 15th century heretic and martyr Jan Hus. After initial suspicion, the Hussites eagerly embraced Luther, and vice versa. Their strong tradition of political independence, established in a brutal war in the 30 years following Hus's execution in 1415, meant that they could easily resist Habsburg attempts to call them to order. Secure in their knowledge that the new Habsburg monarchy, rulers in Hungary and Bohemia since the death of King Louis Jagiello in the defeat at Mohacs in 1526, could hardly rule these lands without the cooperation of their powerful estates, the Bohemian and Hungarian nobles extracted a high price for their support, and that included the toleration of Protestantism. The ironic result was that the Habsburg emperors elsewhere, the most resolute opponents of the evangelical movement, were forced to accept in these lands well-organized and strong Protestant churches, which became the dominant religious culture in these lands. The restoration of Catholic hegemony was forced to await the Habsburg victory in the early phase of the 30 Years' War. The kingdoms of Scandinavia, too, became bastions of the new religion, though here the introduction of a robust and orthodox Lutheranism had less to do with local enthusiasm than with the determination of two strong-minded and opportunistic kings. Whereas in the case of Christian IV of Denmark, conviction possibly outweighed political considerations, with Gustavus Vasa of Sweden the opposite was certainly the case. Whatever the motive, the result was to build royal power at the expense of both the nobility and the clergy. In the case of Denmark, it is possible to talk of an alliance between the king, who had already introduced reform in his German lands, of Schleswig-Holstein before succeeding to the throne, and the towns, for both Malmo and Copenhagen, showed a considerable propensity to reform. It required a brief but decisive civil war in 1536 to overcome the entrenched opposition of the Catholic landed nobility to Christian's succession on the death of his uncle, the more cautious Frederick I. But after this, the conversion of Denmark into a Protestant state proceeded apace. In 1537, the new king signed a church order drawn up by Luther's closest lieutenant, Johannes Bugenhagen, who also on this visit ordained the first 7 Lutheran superintendents. A Lutheran state church had been established only a decade after the Reformation had first begun to make an impact. Sweden pursued a somewhat different course, partly because, in the case of Gustavus Vasa, there is little evidence of any disposition to favor Protestantism for its own sake. Rather, perhaps profiting from the example of the German princes who had adopted the Reformation, Gustavus clearly discerned the potential of the new evangelical teaching to assist his attack on the wealth and influence of the Church in Sweden. The Reformation would experience several setbacks before a parliament in 1539 granted the king full control over the Swedish Church. Even so, the country would wait a further 30 years before the promulgation of a Protestant church order, 1571. The very different character of the Scandinavian Reformation is underlined by the relative scarcity of vernacular religious literature to promote the new doctrines. This was hardly surprising. Neither country had the population to sustain a printing industry of any size, nor the critical mass of town dwellers to provide a market. In Sweden and Denmark, the task of inculcating the new beliefs would necessarily follow the acts of state which won both lands to Protestantism. This ends part 1.